Mexico, 1985. A city draped in neon, shadows stretching across its cobblestone streets. The air is thick, damp with the scent of gasoline and sweat. Somewhere in the heart of Guadalajara, behind the barred windows of a modest house, history is about to take a turn so brutal, the world would never forget. Inside the house, the air is silent. Too silent. And then, the creak of an old wooden chair. A man sits bound to it, wrists tied tight with coarse rope, ankles shackled. His breathing is ragged, uneven. His name is Enrique Kiki Camarena. A DEA agent. An American. A man who thought he could pull at the threads of Mexico's drug empire without being noticed. Tonight, that gamble ends. Camarena's head tilts forward, blood trickling from his mouth. His eyes flick toward the door, he can hear voices. Laughter. The sound of glasses clinking. In the next room, three men sit as though they own not just the house, not just the city, but the country itself. Rafael Caro Quintero. Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca. And Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. The architects of the Guadalajara Cartel, the men who built Mexico's first true drug empire. They sip whiskey as if nothing extraordinary is happening. As if, just a few feet away, a man isn't screaming into the darkness. That's the thing about power, it numbs the horror. It makes cruelty routine. And then, it begins. A fist crashes against Camarena's jaw. The sound of breaking bone echoes through the room. He cries out, his voice cracking, but no one outside hears. Or if they do, they look the other way. The police outside the gates stand silent. Paid off. Loyal not to the badge, but to the men inside. This is not just an interrogation. It is a message. To the DEA. To America. To anyone who dares to threaten the pipeline of money, drugs, and power flowing north. Every blow carries with it a warning, stay away from Mexico. But Camarena refuses to give them what they want. With each passing second, with each jolt of pain, he holds on. He knows the cost. He knows he will never walk out of this room alive. Meanwhile, the voices in the next room grow louder. Caro Quintero jokes about politicians. Don Neto lights another cigarette. Félix Gallardo leans forward, calculating, silent. He doesn't need to laugh. His power isn't in his words, it's in his presence. Everyone in the room knows, even in silence, he commands. The city outside moves as if nothing is wrong. Taxis idle on corners. Lovers walk beneath flickering street lamps. Families eat dinner, unaware, or unwilling to see, what is unfolding just blocks away. That's the terrifying truth about cartel power. Violence isn't hidden. It's tolerated. Normalized. And when people choose silence, empires grow unchecked. Inside, time drags on. Seconds stretch into minutes. A clock ticks, cold and indifferent. For Kiki Camarena, every tick is borrowed time. For the cartel, every tick is another step toward invincibility. And here is the cruel irony. Camarena wasn't just fighting a cartel. He was fighting an entire system, a web of corruption so deep that the line between government and criminal blurred to nothing. That's why he's here tonight. That's why no one will save him. By dawn, the man tied to this chair will be gone. His body buried in the Mexican soil. But his screams will echo far beyond this house, beyond this city. His death will change everything. The DEA will rage. Washington will demand blood. In Mexico will never be the same again. But here's the truth, this isn't the end of the story. This is only the beginning. Because to understand how the Guadalajara Cartel rose to power, to understand how Mexico's entire drug war was born, we must go back. Back before this night. Back to the seeds of an empire that would reshape a nation. This is not just a story about drugs. This is the story of a blueprint. The moment Mexico's cartels stopped being gangs, and became empires. It begins in the shadows of Guadalajara. A city known for tequila and mariachi, but beneath the music and color, something darker was being born. A syndicate. A machine. A new power that would rise to challenge not just law enforcement, but governments themselves. The architects were three men. Different in style. United in ambition. They would carve a path through blood and corruption, bribing police, charming politicians, and striking deals with the deadliest traffickers on earth. And in their pursuit of power, they unleashed a war. Not just in Mexico, but across the border, in America. A war still burning to this day. This is the rise of the Guadalajara Cartel. The empire that birthed the modern drug war. The story of how one syndicate rewrote Mexico's destiny. To understand it, we must go back to the man who would one day be called the Godfather of the cartels. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into tonight's story, I have a small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this one, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell us which city you're watching from, it helps this channel more than you know. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how Mexico's drug empire was born, you first have to understand the land where it began. Sinaloa. A place of beauty, and a place of blood. For generations, Sinaloa's rugged mountains have been a land of survival. Farmers worked the soil. Families lived off the land. But the same earth that grew corn and beans, could also grow something else. Something far more valuable. In the 1940s and 50s, while America was fighting wars overseas, in Mexico another trade quietly flourished, opium and marijuana. Grown in secret valleys. Shipped north. Sold to soldiers, students, and addicts across the border. This was the seat of the drug trade. Small groups, scattered traffickers, smuggling in shadows. They weren't cartels yet, just men with connections, crops, and the will to take risks. But Mexico was not just fertile soil for drugs. It was fertile soil for corruption. Politicians looked the other way. Police officers accepted envelopes of cash. And the traffickers grew bolder. And in this world of shadows, one man began to rise. A man whose name would echo in fear for decades, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Gallardo was different. Unlike most traffickers, he was educated. Polished. Charming. A former policeman. He wore suits instead of boots. And while others thought like gangsters, he thought like a businessman. At first, he wasn't the kingpin. He was just a man with connections. Working security for the family of Leopoldo Sanchez Silas, the governor of Sinaloa. It was here Gallardo learned the most important lesson of his career. In Mexico, power did not come from guns. It came from politics. Through the governor's circle, Gallardo rubbed shoulders with politicians, police commanders, and businessmen. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. Every handshake. Every deal. Every secret. And soon, Gallardo saw what others could not. That Mexico's drug trade was broken. Scattered. Inefficient. Farmers growing poppies here, smugglers running marijuana there, no coordination, no control. It was chaos. What if, Gallardo thought, someone could bring them all together? Not as rivals. But as partners. A federation. A true cartel. It was a radical idea. To unite traffickers under one banner. To share routes. To avoid wars. And to funnel rivers of money into pockets, not just theirs, but into police chiefs, governors, and even federal agents. But Gallardo couldn't do it alone. To build an empire, he needed allies. Men as ruthless as himself. And soon, he would find them. The three of them would form the backbone of Mexico's first true drug cartel. A brotherhood of ambition. A pact sealed in blood, money, and betrayal. Together, they would change history. But before they could build an empire, they had to prove it could be done. And their first test would come from a crop unlike any the world had ever seen. A farm so massive, it would shock the DEA, terrify America, and make the cartel untouchable. They called it Rancho Buffalo. By the early 1980s, the seeds of Mexico's first drug empire had been planted. But seeds alone meant nothing. If Gallardo, Fonseca, and Caro Quintero were to dominate, they needed proof. A demonstration of power so bold, so massive, the world would never forget it. That proof would come in a place called Rancho Buffalo. On the surface, it was just another ranch in the Chihuahua Desert. But behind its gates was something extraordinary. Rancho Buffalo wasn't just a farm. It was the largest marijuana plantation the world had ever seen. More than 1,000 acres of cannabis, stretching farther than the eye could see. And this wasn't random weed. This was carefully cultivated, irrigated, and engineered for mass production. It was the cartel's industrial revolution. At its peak, Rancho Buffalo employed thousands of workers. Poor farmers, recruited by the cartel, working under armed guard. Day and night, they labored in silence, knowing one mistake could cost them their lives. The scale was staggering. DEA agents would later estimate the farm was producing billions of dollars in product each year. Enough to flood entire U.S. cities with Mexican marijuana. But here's the truth, a farm this size couldn't exist without protection. And Gallardo had arranged plenty of it. Police guarded the gates. Politicians kept quiet. And when the army came for inspections, they saw nothing. For years, the farm operated in plain sight. A symbol of corruption. A symbol of power. And a warning that the Guadalajara Cartel was untouchable. But no empire rises without enemies. In Washington, the DEA was watching. Reports of massive shipments crossing the border couldn't be ignored. Something was feeding America's marijuana market, and agents were determined to find it. When DEA intelligence finally uncovered Rancho Buffalo, it sounded too insane to be real. $1 billion marijuana farm? In the open? With government protection? It couldn't be true, until they saw it with their own eyes. November 1984. Operation Rancho Buffalo. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers, backed by DEA intelligence, stormed the plantation. What they found stunned the world. They torched the fields. Flames ripped through acres of cannabis. Smoke rose into the desert sky, visible for miles. Billions of dollars in cartel profits, gone in a single day. The DEA celebrated. The world cheered. But in Mexico, Gallardo, Fonseca, and Caro Quintero were furious. Their empire had been wounded. Their pride humiliated. And someone had to pay. The cartel believed someone had betrayed them. Someone had tipped off the DEA. And in their world, betrayal was answered with blood. And soon, they would set their eyes on a target. A man whose determination to stop them would seal his fate. His name was Enrique Kiki Camarena. And his death would ignite a war that changed history. In the aftermath of Rancho Buffalo, the Guadalajara Cartel stood wounded, but not broken. The DEA had burned their billion-dollar fields, embarrassed them before the world. But the cartel had money, connections, and a deadly reputation. They would recover. What they would not forgive was humiliation. And among cartel bosses, one question haunted every conversation: who was responsible? Who had dared to touch the untouchable? The whispers all led to one man. A DEA agent stationed in Guadalajara. His name was Enrique Kiki Camarena. Kiki wasn't like most agents. He had grown up in Mexicali, just across the border. He spoke the language. He understood the culture. And he knew the pain drugs caused in communities, because he had seen it with his own eyes. By 1981, he was transferred to Guadalajara. His mission, to crack the networks flooding the United States with Mexican marijuana. But what he found was something far bigger. Kiki quickly realized Guadalajara wasn't just another posting. This city was the beating heart of Mexico's drug trade. And everywhere he looked, the cartel's fingerprints were there. Police looked the other way. Politicians grew rich. Even army generals enjoyed the cartel's generosity. But unlike others, Kiki refused to stay quiet. He built a network of informants, farmers, and street contacts. Piece by piece, he uncovered the truth. Rancho Buffalo wasn't just a farm, it was the blueprint for an empire. And the men at the top were Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. The cartel had noticed him. An agent asking too many questions. An American in their city, snooping where he didn't belong. And in Mexico, when the cartel noticed you, it was never good. But Kiki pressed on. He warned his superiors that the Guadalajara Cartel was bigger than anyone realized. That it wasn't just smuggling weed, it was building alliances with Colombian traffickers. Cocaine was about to become Mexico's next export. Washington listened, but too slowly. The DEA was small, underfunded, and constantly restrained by diplomacy. Meanwhile, Kiki was walking a tightrope in Guadalajara, exposed, vulnerable, and surrounded by enemies. By late 1984, after Rancho Buffalo was destroyed, whispers of betrayal spread through the cartel. And when the bosses asked who had guided the DEA, all eyes turned to Camarena. He wasn't just a problem anymore. He was a target. The decision was made. Quietly. Brutally. Kiki Camarena would be silenced. Not only as punishment, but as a message. No one crossed the Guadalajara Cartel and lived. In February 1985, the trap was set. Kiki left the U.S. consulate one afternoon. He walked toward his car. And in broad daylight, he was surrounded. For 30 hours, Kiki was held inside a cartel safe house. Tortured. Beaten. Questioned. And all the while, the Guadalajara Cartel celebrated, convinced they had sent a message the DEA could never ignore. When Kiki's body was discovered weeks later, dumped on the roadside, the world was horrified. His skull fractured. His ribs broken. His body bore the marks of hours of agony. But more than his death, it was the silence of the system that shocked the world. Because Kiki Camarena hadn't just been murdered. He had been executed with the blessing of politicians, police, and generals. The cartel had proven it controlled not just drugs, but Mexico itself. And now, the United States had no choice but to fight back. February 1985. Mexico was already a land wrapped in shadows, but on this day, the darkness grew unbearable. For nearly a month, DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena had been missing. His wife, Mika, woke every morning to the same nightmare: no word, no calls, just silence. And in Guadalajara, the silence screamed the loudest. When his body was finally discovered, it was worse than anyone imagined. Kiki's remains were pulled from the earth, wrapped in plastic, discarded like trash. His body told a story too cruel to put into words: broken ribs, a fractured skull, burns, and endless bruises. He had been beaten, tortured, kept alive for days. The autopsy would later confirm what no one wanted to believe: Kiki had suffered for over 30 hours before death finally came. To the DEA, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just murder, it was a declaration of war. The Guadalajara Cartel had crossed a line that no cartel had dared cross before, killing a U.S. federal agent on foreign soil. And they hadn't just killed him. They'd sent a message written in blood: we are untouchable. In Washington, D.C., the news hit like a bomb. The Reagan administration was furious. Senators demanded retaliation. And for the DEA, this was no longer about drug trafficking, it was personal. At Camarena's funeral in Calexico, California, thousands gathered to honor a man who became a martyr. His wife Mika stood stoic, his children too young to understand why their father was lowered into the ground. Every DEA agent present swore the same silent vow: this would not go unpunished. But in Mexico, the reality was different. Politicians issued statements of outrage, but behind closed doors, many of them already knew the truth: the Guadalajara Cartel had protection at the highest levels of government. Police, judges, even generals owed their loyalty to Félix Gallardo and his partners. For ordinary Mexicans, the discovery of Kiki's body was both shocking and terrifying. If the U.S. government couldn't protect its own agents, what chance did a street vendor, a farmer, or a taxi driver have against men who ruled with guns and money? The U.S. responded with fury. Operation Leyenda was launched, the largest DEA investigation in history. For the first time, American agents were unleashed across Mexico, tasked with one goal: find who killed Kiki Camarena, and bring them to justice. But justice wouldn't come easy. The cartels weren't hiding in the shadows anymore, they were standing in plain sight, protected by the very institutions meant to bring order. For every honest cop, there were 10 on the payroll of Gallardo. For every lead the DEA found, another was buried under bribes. The discovery of Kiki's body had ripped the mask off Mexico's institutions. What America saw now was a government too entangled with the cartels to act independently. But the DEA didn't care. For them, this was a hunt. In the barrios of Guadalajara, whispers grew louder: "Los gringos vienen." The gringos are coming. And they were right. Across the border, Operation Leyenda's first targets were already being marked. What followed would be a campaign of arrests, raids, and betrayals that would tear the cartel from the inside out. The discovery of Kiki Camarena's body wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the bloodiest chapter yet. Inside DEA headquarters, the war room grew hotter. Faces of cartel leaders were pinned to corkboards, strings connecting names to murders, smuggling routes, and bribes. Every day, the map filled with more blood. Outside, anger spilled into the streets. In Mexico City, protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, some demanding justice, others fearing the chaos that justice might bring. The air was heavy, tense. Meanwhile, Guadalajara pulsed under neon lights. A city alive on the surface, but beneath it, fear and silence. Everyone knew who truly held the power, but no one dared to say the names out loud. And in the shadows of both nations, symbols clashed, the weight of American justice against Mexican sovereignty. But this was more than diplomacy, it was blood for blood. The discovery of Kiki Camarena's body sent shockwaves not only through Washington but deep into the dusty streets of Guadalajara. For the DEA, grief had turned to rage. The mission was now crystal clear: find the men responsible, drag them out of hiding, and make them pay. This wasn't going to be another sting operation. This was going to be a hunt. At the heart of Operation Leyenda were men and women who had worked alongside Kiki, who had shared cigarettes, laughs, and long stakeouts. Now, their friend's voice was gone, replaced by the weight of unfinished business. The first name on the list, Rafael Caro Quintero, the young, hot-headed drug lord known for his wealth, his women, and his violent temper. Intelligence reports placed him moving between safe houses in Guadalajara, always surrounded by armed men. The DEA leaned hard on Mexican authorities for help. But loyalty in Mexico was complicated. Some cops would tip off the Americans, others would tip off the cartels. In this deadly game, no one was sure who was on whose side. Then came the break. Word reached the DEA that Caro Quintero was traveling north, planning to escape Mexico by air. His mistress had been spotted booking a private flight. If true, this was their chance. On April 4, 1985, acting on a tip, Mexican federal agents and soldiers stormed a villa in Costa Rica. Inside, Caro Quintero was found, relaxed, almost smug, as if convinced his political protection would never let him fall. But this time, it didn't save him. When news broke that Caro had been captured, celebrations erupted in DEA offices across the border. But the hunt was far from over. The DEA wasn't satisfied with just one head of the snake. Next came Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, the older, cunning padrino of the cartel. Don Neto was careful, moving only with trusted men. He had survived decades in the game, but the pressure was closing in. In April 1985, Mexican soldiers surrounded one of Don Neto's ranches. Gunfire broke out. After a tense standoff, the padrino was captured. Another pillar of the Guadalajara Cartel had fallen. But the biggest prize remained free. The mastermind. The Godfather himself, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. He was smarter, colder, and far more connected than his partners. Taking him down would be like pulling a knife from the heart of Mexico's political establishment. And Felix knew it. He didn't run like Caro. He didn't fight like Don Neto. He blended into the corridors of power, smiling at politicians by day and commanding traffickers by night. As Operation Leyenda expanded, the DEA realized they weren't just fighting traffickers, they were fighting an entire system. Each arrest meant peeling back another layer of corruption, another bribe, another betrayal. For ordinary Mexicans, the manhunt brought only more chaos. Raids turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Soldiers blocked roads, helicopters roared overhead, and whispers filled the markets. ¿A quién agarraron ahora? Who did they catch this time? Every arrest tightened the noose. Every capture brought the DEA closer. But Félix Gallardo remained just out of reach, like a ghost. He was untouchable, at least, for now. The manhunt had begun with fury. But what came next was something neither the US nor Mexico could control, a storm of betrayals, double crosses, and bloody wars that would change Mexico forever. By 1986, the Guadalajara Cartel seemed broken. Caro Quintero was in custody. Don Neto was behind bars. The DEA celebrated their victories, convinced they had delivered justice for Kiki Camarena. But beneath the surface, the real power had barely shifted. Because the man who mattered most, the one pulling the strings, was still free. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Unlike his partners, Felix wasn't reckless. He didn't flaunt his wealth with wild parties or mansions filled with tigers. His power wasn't in guns or cocaine, it was in the invisible web of influence he controlled. Felix had been a former police officer. He knew how the system worked. He knew who could be bribed, who could be threatened, and who simply needed to be invited to dinner. In Mexico, loyalty wasn't won, it was purchased. While his allies rotted in cells, Felix transformed. He became a ghost, no longer just a trafficker, but a shadow statesman. His power grew in silence, hidden beneath the very institutions meant to stop him. The DA knew who he was. They knew he had ordered Kiki's murder. They knew he controlled the entire flow of drugs through Mexico. But knowing wasn't enough. Every time they reached for him, their hands came up empty. Files disappeared. Judges stalled cases. Witnesses went missing. For ordinary Mexicans, Felix wasn't just a narco, he was an untouchable. People whispered his name in cantinas, in markets, in hushed tones on buses. To some, he was a devil. To others, a necessary evil keeping worse chaos at bay. In truth, Félix Gallardo had built something unprecedented. He had transformed the Guadalajara Cartel into a federation, a carefully designed empire where different plazas, or territories, operated under his watchful eye. Each plaza paid tribute. Each plaza followed the rules. This wasn't just smuggling anymore. It was business. An empire built on contracts, negotiations, and discipline. For every load of cocaine that left Colombia, Felix ensured it traveled through Mexico with military precision. The Colombians respected him. Unlike the chaotic cartels in Medellin or Cali, Felix offered structure. He was reliable. He could move product across the US border like no one else. And with every deal, his empire grew richer. But what made Felix so dangerous wasn't his wealth or his product. It was his ability to control violence. Unlike Caro, he didn't kill for spectacle. Unlike Don Neto, he didn't wage open wars. He understood that true power came from restraint. Violence was a tool, not a weakness. Still, the ghosts of Kiki Camarena haunted the DEA. They wanted Felix. They demanded him. But every lead ended in silence. Politicians stalled. Mexican police shrugged. It was as if Félix Gallardo was shielded by an invisible wall of power. By the late 1980s, Felix was at the height of his empire. Cocaine shipments flowed like rivers. Politicians bowed at his table. And in the streets of Mexico, his name was both feared and respected. But history has a way of catching up with even the untouchable. And the cracks in his empire were already beginning to show. Ambition had built his empire. But ambition was also its curse. His lieutenants, the men who ran plazas in Tijuana, Juarez, and Sinaloa, were growing restless. They wanted more power, more territory, more independence. Felix had created the perfect machine. But like any machine, the moment its gears began to grind against each other, sparks would fly. And those sparks would ignite the wars that tore Mexico apart. For now, the Godfather remained untouchable. But in the shadows, betrayal was already taking root. And soon, the empire he built would split into pieces, birthing cartels far bloodier, far more brutal, and far less controlled than he could ever imagine. By 1989, the Mexican drug world looked calm on the surface. Félix Gallardo, El Padrino, the Godfather, was still pulling the strings, orchestrating every shipment of cocaine that crossed the border into the United States. To the DEA, he remained public enemy number one. But inside his empire, the cracks were widening. The federated plazas that once obeyed his word were restless. Greed, betrayal, and ambition were eating away at the machine he had built. The DEA never forgot Kiki Camarena. His death remained an open wound. For years, American agents had been humiliated, forced to watch as the man behind it all walked free. But time was running out for Felix. Because for the first time, his protection was faltering. The problem wasn't just law enforcement. It was the lieutenants he once trusted. In Tijuana, the Arellano Felix brothers grew more violent, more unpredictable. In Juarez, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was building his own fortune. And in Sinaloa, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was waiting patiently in the shadows. Each man wanted more. And each man was beginning to resent the Godfather's iron grip. Then came the betrayal that sealed his fate. A leak from inside the Mexican government, people Felix thought he owned, gave the DEA and the Mexican Federal Police the opening they had been waiting for. On April 8, 1989, the hunt began. They descended on Guadalajara. Block by block, house by house, they searched. For years Felix had been untouchable, shielded by his political allies. But now, even those allies were beginning to turn. The Godfather was running out of shadows to hide in. For 2 days, the man who once ruled Mexico's drug empire evaded capture. Some say he tried to flee to the mountains. Others claim his allies abandoned him, leaving him exposed. But on April 10, 1989, it was over. They found him inside a middle-class home in Guadalajara, calm, composed, wearing a pressed shirt as if he had been waiting for them. There were no shootouts. No last stands. No dramatic escape. The Godfather, who had once dined with governors and generals, walked out in handcuffs. For the DEA, it was justice. For Mexico, it was the beginning of something far worse. Because without Félix Gallardo, the Federation collapsed. The empire he built, his masterpiece of order and discipline, crumbled overnight. The plazas no longer had a Godfather to obey. And when men like the Arellanos, Amado Carrillo, and El Chapo fought for control, the bloodshed would be unlike anything Mexico had seen before. Inside prison, Felix still tried to control his empire. He smuggled out orders through letters, through bribes, through the same web of corruption he had always relied on. But it was no longer enough. The younger generation was too hungry, too ambitious, too violent. To many, his arrest was the end of an era. The age of quiet deals, of restraint, of discreet corruption was gone. The age of open war had begun. For the DEA, it was a victory. But victories in the drug war were always temporary. Because with Félix Gallardo gone, Mexico wasn't free of cartels. It was flooded with them. In the years that followed, the Tijuana Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, and the Sinaloa Cartel would rise from the ashes of Guadalajara. Each one more ruthless. Each one carving Mexico into battlefields. And the violence that would claim tens of thousands of lives was born from the fall of one man, the Godfather. Félix Gallardo sits in prison to this day. Old, frail, blind in one eye, he still denies he ever murdered Kiki Camarena. To some, he's a relic of the past. To others, the architect of modern Mexico's endless war. But one truth remains undeniable: the empire he built never truly died. It only multiplied, splintered, and became the nightmare Mexico still lives with today. The Guadalajara Cartel may be gone, but its blueprint endures. And every bullet fired in Mexico's drug war can be traced back to the man they once called El Padrino. This is how the Guadalajara Cartel created Mexico's drug empire. When Félix Gallardo was led away in handcuffs, many believed Mexico's nightmare was over. But in truth, the Godfather's arrest was not the end, it was the beginning of something far worse. Because the empire he had built, the federation that once united every plaza under a single hand, did not simply vanish. It shattered. And from those broken pieces, new cartels were born. The Arellano Felix brothers took control of Tijuana. They were young, ambitious, and ruthless, a family bound not only by blood but by violence. Under their rule, the Tijuana cartel became infamous for torture, executions, and unrelenting brutality. In Juarez, Amado Carrillo Fuentes rose to power. Known as El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, he built an empire on airplanes. Massive cargo jets, filled to the brim with cocaine, soared through the night sky. His genius wasn't violence, it was logistics. And in Sinaloa, Joaquin Guzman Lora, better known as El Chapo, began to emerge. He was underestimated at first, just another smuggler, just another gangster. But Chapo's brilliance lay underground. He pioneered the use of tunnels, invisible highways beneath the border that the DEA could not stop. For the first time, Mexico was no longer ruled by one voice. It was ruled by many. And those voices screamed louder, killed faster, and trusted no one. The Federation was dead. In its place, warlords. Violence exploded. In Tijuana, the Arellanos turned the city into a war zone, their hitmen spraying bullets in broad daylight. Bodies dangled from bridges. Their cruelty was designed not just to kill, but to terrify. In Juarez, Amado was more subtle. He bribed, negotiated, and flew. His planes became flying fortresses of cocaine, carrying more than any smuggler had ever dared. By the mid-1990s, he controlled the single most profitable trafficking route in the world. But Amado's reign ended as suddenly as it began. In 1997, during a botched plastic surgery meant to change his face, he died on the operating table. Some said it was fate. Others said it was murder. His death triggered yet another war, as lieutenants and rivals tore Juarez apart in their struggle for the throne. Meanwhile, El Chapo was rising. He was clever, elusive, and most importantly, patient. While other cartels killed openly, Chapo built quietly. He dug tunnels, paid off entire police forces, and studied the weaknesses of his enemies. When the moment was right, he struck. By the late 1990s, Mexico was no longer a country ruled by one cartel. It was a battlefield carved into territories, each controlled by men who would rather burn the nation to ash than lose an inch of power. And this was just the beginning. The 2000s would bring even more chaos. Los Zetas, former soldiers turned assassins, would unleash military-grade terror on civilians. The Gulf Cartel would carve its own empire. And the Sinaloa Cartel, led by Chapo, would grow into the most powerful drug organization in history. Every murder, every massacre, every shipment of drugs that followed could be traced back to one moment: the collapse of the Guadalajara Cartel. Kiki Camarena's death was supposed to silence the DEA. Instead, it ignited a war that has lasted nearly 4 decades. And Mexico is still bleeding from the wound. From Tijuana to Juarez, from Sinaloa to Michoacán, from Nuevo Laredo to Monterrey, the blueprint that Félix Gallardo created is still alive. But it is no longer controlled. It is chaos. The Guadalajara Cartel may have fallen. But in its place rose an empire of death, wealth, and blood that reshaped Mexico forever. And it all began with the Godfather. The Guadalajara Cartel no longer exists. Its leaders are either dead, in prison, or living in silence. And yet, their shadows still move across Mexico. What they created, the blueprint for modern drug trafficking, did not vanish. It multiplied. It evolved. It metastasized. Today, Mexico is home to dozens of cartels. The Sinaloa Cartel, once a splinter, has grown into a global powerhouse, moving billions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl across borders. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, has risen from obscurity to dominate entire regions with military weapons, armored convoys, and terror campaigns. They no longer hide. They film themselves. They boast their power to the world. Every year, tens of thousands vanish. Families wake up to silence. Mothers search fields filled with shallow graves. This is the true inheritance of Guadalajara, a nation gripped by fear, where the line between state and cartel is often invisible. And yet, even in the bloodshed, one fact remains: the cartels were never just criminals. They were businessmen, diplomats, strategists. Men who understood that power in Mexico is not taken by vote, it is taken by fear. The U.S. fought its war on drugs with billions of dollars, soldiers, and walls. But as long as Americans craved cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, the cartels only grew stronger. Kiki Camarena's death was not in vain. His sacrifice exposed the corruption that allowed Guadalajara to flourish. But it also proved something darker: killing one man could not stop a machine that fed on billions. Félix Gallardo, once untouchable, now sits in prison, an old man in a wheelchair, his voice faint, his empire dust. But even he admits, he set into motion something far greater than himself. And so Mexico continues to bleed. Every bullet fired, every mother who buries her son, every soldier lost in ambush, all of it can be traced back to the night Guadalajara fell. The question that haunts Mexico is not how the Guadalajara cartel rose. It is how no one has been able to stop what came after. Cartel leaders rise and fall. Governments change. Wars are declared, then abandoned. But the machine continues, unstoppable, unrelenting. It is no longer one cartel. It is an ecosystem. A hydra. Cut off one head, and 3 more grow in its place. 40 years ago, Guadalajara was a city of secrets. Now, the entire world knows. The war that began in its streets has spread across continents, touching everyone, from Colombian jungles to American suburbs, from European ports to Asian markets. But the greatest tragedy is not in the power of the cartels. It is in the silence of their victims. The thousands of voices that will never be heard again. The generations stolen. The futures erased. And so we are left with one truth: the Guadalajara cartel created Mexico's drug empire. But what it left behind is something even darker: a war without end. This is the story of power, betrayal, and empire. This is the story of Félix Gallardo, Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca. This is the story of Kiki Camarena. This is the story of the Guadalajara cartel. And it is far from over. If you want more stories like this, make sure to like this video, share it with others, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for the next one.